This is basically 100% hemp. Wadsy will talk about that later, but the longer I've been involved with the Hemp Embassy, the more I'm realising what an amazing plant it is. So anything that can be made from hydrocarbons can be made from carbohydrates. And it's worth Googling Henry Ford's hemp car and have a look. When they banned cannabis in America, they created the name marijuana out of a Mexican slang word, so all the hundreds of thousands of hemp farmers didn't know overnight their crop was made illegal. It's a bit, when you look up the origins of prohibition, it's a really seriously big scam. It's such a useful plant. It was probably the most grown plant on the planet 200 years ago. So you realise when the petrochemical and pharmaceutical worlds arrived in the 1930s, they basically got rid of cannabis. It was the big competition in nature. It's interesting. So Wadsy will talk about that after. I'm going to introduce you to the Secretary of the Hemp Party, Andrew Kavasilas, who's also the Northern Territory Senate candidate. He's going up there next week. But he's a long-time medical cannabis, let's say knowledge gatherer, and also an industrial hemp licensed farmer. Andrew.
Hey, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, look, thanks everyone for coming. It was short notice and we weren't sure how we'd go, but we do get a lot of inquiries here at the Hemp Embassy, like every day, so that's why we thought, you know, we'll just make a day of it. Yeah, run up to the election as well. Michael's, I don't know if he mentioned earlier, he's running in Western Australia, I'm running in the NT, and we've also got Therese Howe, who is running up in Queensland. So all that's pretty exciting at the moment. But today, yeah, about, you know, we're here to talk about medical cannabis, and obviously, you know, people like Al and there's a lot of other people quite knowledgeable. You go on the web and there's quite a lot being spoken about. And yes, cannabis has got great medical properties, has had for a long, long time. It's got some kind of symbiosis with the human body. We have receptors that, you know, do very well by being stimulated by cannabinoids. You know, 80 odd years ago that all changed, they made it illegal, and we find ourselves in the situation now. It's important to note though, and I don't think a lot of people understand that Australia, you know, people like yourselves and all over the country who are calling for medical cannabis, this is going on all over the world. There's no government in the world that has willingly introduced meaningful medical cannabis regime. And it's important to have a look, like in the USA, where you see the states that have got medical cannabis regimes. The important thing to know there is that all those states ran no campaigns. At the moment, they're you know, from California back in 1996, you know, they ran no campaigns. At the moment, at the next election, California's the people of California have initiated a referendum question, and it is similar to the Colorado initiative that regulates cannabis for sort of recreational purposes. At the moment in California, the government there has got big billboards up next to highways, vote no to recreational cannabis. In Canada, they have a Bill of Rights, and what happened, there was a series of court cases that ended up in the High Court that went in favour of people, these two defendants, using medical cannabis. And as an extension of that, and with the power of a Bill of Rights, the High Court ordered the government over there to initiate a medical cannabis regime. In fact, within a year. They end up taking 2 years, and it wasn't very good. The people stepped in, and the people started doing it. And that's how we've got, you know, over there they still have dispensaries and licensed grows, and there's... But the government hasn't got involved. And just like in the US and in Canada, there's no clinical trials. And that's always been the thing. And every time it gets mentioned here, by, you know, whether it's Baird or the Queensland government or the Victorian government, they can always say, and the AMA, they will always be able to say there's not enough clinical trials. And that's the fact. Cannabis... You know, just to put it really in a nutshell and to kind of explain why in spite of states in the US having some kind of a medical cannabis regime going, but it's illegal federally. In Canada, you've got a medical cannabis regime, but there's no clinical trials. I was there last year, and the Health Minister of Canada was saying, quote, "Cannabis is not medicine. A court cannot decide what a medicine is. Only Health Canada can." And cannabis, marijuana, they always say marijuana over there, but she was very critical. In fact, she said the Canadian government is still outraged at the decisions made by the High Court. Look, now that government's changed, the new government's in with a promise of regulating cannabis, but they haven't, and they're in fact marching time, and as we speak now there is police raids going on and around Toronto, and they're getting ready in Vancouver to start raiding dispensaries. So again, no clinical trials. Even those dispensaries cannot use a banking system. Same in the US, they cannot use a banking system. In Israel, where they've had 27 years, nearly 30 years of medical cannabis research, there's still no product, no pharmaceutical, no prescription medicine to the patients. A lot of the patients they still have now, they boast something like 20,000 patients. Most of those are in private palliative care on private kibbutzes, so they're quite removed from the general medical profession. The problem is at the top, and when I try and explain what's putting it all in context, here's the context. It's like opium for lawful purposes. There's a few companies that own that opium, and there's no big swag of companies growing it everywhere. In fact, 2 foreign companies grow half the world's opium in Australia, and there's no Australian company owns any of that or has access to that opium to research to produce better or products or anything like that. There's 2 companies, they own that. Why would they give them somebody seed to grow poppies to make another product which could be better unless they're going to do it? So cannabis is in the same boat. There is a lawful source, as described under the UN Drug Convention, that could be used for clinical purposes and clinical research. But the bottleneck, and it's always talked about in the parliamentary inquiries that we've had here in Australia, the international obstacles and roadblocks to the scientific research and medical use of cannabis. So there is a company, we reckon it's Monsanto, because they have commented on it, and they grow cannabis every other year at the University of Mississippi. This is for research for lawful purposes, and they distribute it through a US drug agency called NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And so NIDA is in fact the only lawful source of cannabis for medical and scientific research as described under the UN Drug Conventions that governments always speak of. We've got, and this body, NIDA, has been taken to court under injunctions in the US by research bodies with research ready to go, ethics approval, and have been ready to go for research. They just need the cannabis to do the research with. And I've followed a few cases, one in particular where they got an injunction and they got the body to front up and explain themselves in court, and they basically said, we don't have to supply cannabis to everyone, we pick and choose. And I think the most telling quote was, and this will put it in context, that they only supply and fund research into the negative consequences of cannabis use, not medical beneficial purposes. So that's been the situation for the last 60-odd years, and that's where the government and the AMA and the medical profession have it on us, is that yes, there hasn't been the clinical trial, there isn't enough. Anecdotal evidence, lots of that. And what there also is a lot of research that gets published as making claims to, curing cancer and all these other claims. When you read those research projects, they're in vitro with single molecules. That's about as far as research can go in this area, is single molecule, usually Delta-9 or CBD more recently. And it's quite interesting, especially when you see cannabis campaigners pointing to research indicating that cannabis can cure cancer, and you go and read that research and it's actually a pharmaceuticalised single molecule done in vitro situation. And when you can find many similar research papers like that, whether it's turmeric nowadays or a bleach will kill cancer in a test tube as well, or in vitro. So these a lot of the research we look at there, we have to look at carefully. What we do know is that whole cannabis products, and by and large a lot of the medical cannabis anecdotal evidence that we have now would indicate that street cannabis, normal whole cannabis heads, whether smoked or turned into a tincture or into a balm or whatever, medical cannabis in contemporary terms now is that street cannabis, is street pot, the illegal stuff. And that's what's drawing all the anecdotal evidence. I think we all just have to remember too, when governments talk about, and the medical profession talk about developing new products, they always talk about 5 to 10 years before it reaches the market and reaching people and $1 billion and that kind of thing. So, without getting too political, I mean, both the prospective prime ministers and all the majors at the moment aren't promising anything other than prescription type drugs that won't be anywhere close to being done in the term of the next government. So that's where I hope I haven't put too much of a negative slant on it, but it should give people an idea on where we're at. The context in which we're fighting is that most of the people in the world want medical cannabis as well, but governments aren't doing it anywhere. The clinical trials and the research that's needed is not being done because there is, as described by many parliamentary inquiries here in Australia, there is international obstacles and international roadblocks. And just to give you a little bit of a timeline on even my association with it, and hope people can remember when back in early 2000s when Bob Carr, New South Wales Premier, was talking very highly of getting medical cannabis up and wanting to do it, and he just wasn't able to. We were working quite closely with the government at the time, and we managed to get some research projects up, some very early ones, but it became apparent that, you know, we were in the same boat as every other state government of every other country in the world, and that we were not going to be able to do whole cannabis research. So, and I think also, just to back what I'm saying is, I mean, we've got the Sydney University. They got a donation of $34 million last year. $34 million. And they cannot buy any cannabis to do any research with. It's just not there. There is a red herring out there, of course, out of Britain called Sativex. It's a spray tincture that the British government bent every rule to let a company called GW Pharmaceuticals begin with cannabis seeds. So we're talking about the lawful source, so we've got to go right back to the source. The British government gave a company seeds that it had seized and let this company go from there. But they also let the professor go to the Netherlands and buy seeds from various seed companies, come back to Britain. Huge investment of money. The company was floated on the stock exchange. It's still out there, GW Pharmaceuticals. And so it began a growing program then and developed a spray tincture product, and it's very good. They had a choice. They could have done a lot of different things. They could have made drops, tinctures, a lozenge, a pill, but they found that the spray, so the spray that they made is actually an alcohol suspension of cannabinoids, and there's buccal glands in the cheeks. You see coca chewers, tobacco chewers, other people that chew things, whole things in their cheeks, because there's glands there that take fat-soluble things, specifically like cannabinoids, which are like a resin in their natural state and aren't really soluble or bioavailable. So, they developed a spray. They found it to be very effective. The buccal glands have got a lot of blood cells, a lot of blood veins, gets blood. The cannabinoids can go through the buccal glands and go into the bloodstream fairly quickly and be processed by the liver. Just getting back to the company GW Pharmaceutical and the products that they made, the product that they made was Sativex, and that product is being trialled here and there around the world, and it seems like when public pressure becomes too much on a government, the government fallback position is we'll grab some Sativex. But again, referring back to the parliamentary inquiries that we've had here in Australia, and in fact the last federal parliamentary inquiry into medical cannabis, by and large, well, not by and large, the actual fact was that the committee found basically talking about Sativex, the English product, was a waste of time. It was too hard to get over here. It was far too expensive. It was hard to titrate and administer in a clinical trial. And so there was problems there. They didn't really identify, and it's about $220 for 5.5 mils, and most of that, obviously 95% of that is alcohol. And it's a 1-to-1 ratio, so about 50% Delta 9 and 50% CBD as the active constituent. So that's where we are with the governments. If you can get a handle on that, no government in the world has willingly introduced a meaningful cannabis regime. There is a red herring out there that what's happening with GW Pharmaceutical, this product. That's also the company making Epidiolex, which is a new product, a high CBD. It could very well be another red herring, and this is specifically for children with epilepsy. The new push, since Bob Carr failed with his push for medical cannabis, the new push has obviously been children with epilepsy, and it's not so much that it's a new thing, but what has happened is the media have started reporting it, they present it to the politicians and they can't ignore it. And this one, they really can't, and so that's why we are pushing forward with this. So, look, Epidiolex is being developed. I don't want to be too pessimistic about it, but as you know, about the whole pharmaceutical angle or pharmaceuticalisation of cannabis, it could just be another red herring like Sativex was, and it may be, good for some people, but probably not for most, but it'll give governments an excuse and another excuse to get those pesky sick people off their back. And that's what it feels like to me. I really hope that they do. I mean, the New South Wales government has been pressing extremely hard to get a group of epileptic children onto a second phase clinical trial that is currently underway in the USA. So that's the promise, really, that the governments here are giving, that they may be able to get some children in Australia onto a paediatric epilepsy trial that's currently underway. And of course, if that was to happen, and the next part of that would be, if the company, GW, who makes this Epidiolex, if they were to come over to Australia and grow some cannabis for that clinical trial, the government's off the hook. The government can now say to the public, we've started clinical trials and yes, it's been grown here. But in actual fact, it's far from being a meaningful operation or anything like that. The government is stalling it right out. Again, I am involved, and others are here. I know that we got another letter last week. The federal government now is going to hold a series of workshops, it seems, around the country, speaking to people, companies who are interested in growing cannabis for the production of medical product. As I said, very expensive stuff, takes a long time, $1 billion, 5 to 10 years before a product reaches the market. If Australia was to make any kind of move like that, we would be the first country in the world to be initiating something like that, especially if we're willingly doing it. I don't really believe it. I think we really have to keep on them. I really wish sometimes we could focus our argument and really be able to make government use the right language so that we do know that they are. Our state governments are lobbying the federal government. The federal government is lobbying hard and making, making approaches to the UN to get interim measures. I think that's the interesting thing, and that's what would all benefit from even here. Interim measures where the government can say, yes, we'll do the clinical trials. It can take 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But in the meantime, interim measures, and that would sort a lot of things out. And interim measures in terms of supply and distribution to patients and people who are needing it, and dissemination of information, very long and detailed. But it's worth spending. I'd definitely do it. I reckon it's a week's worth of conversation just in that, and it would, go from a handful of, from home grow. Obviously, people who want to grow some some cannabis at home. If they want to take the time to grow it for their own medicine, that's fine. But I think we really have to go from that right up to a handful of facilities in several of the states that can supply patients on an ongoing quality control and standard basis. And that would be not just cannabis, but some product as well. And I think, that's why we reckon that the hemp party, vote hemp, we know cannabis better. But look, for a lot of conditions that people are talking about, it's interesting that you can just about pick any subject on nowadays or condition and go on the web and find a lot of different claims and treatments and so forth. And if you really go through and have a look, your own rational mind and your own common sense should be able to say, hey, that's not true. This isn't true. Not everything on the web is real. And it's unfortunate for me to say that, yes, a lot of the claims made about cannabis, especially in medical terms, are not real. If it was that simple, people wouldn't be dying in those states in the US and other places. There's still horrible conditions and horrible diseases that humans get. Cannabis isn't a silver bullet. There's people out there who think, you can get cancer and take cannabis and still eat McDonald's and get over your cancer. That's not going to happen. I think some of the most credible research I have seen on cancer and cannabis as a therapy have been from patients who have continued to see their doctor, but they really did. They changed their diet, they went through their chemo, they in some cases got surgery, but they used cannabis as a therapy all the way through. It gave them an appetite, it gave them a sense of well-being, it stopped nausea, it gave them better sleeps. In a lot of cases it stopped spasms, so post-op where, you've used it before operation or not long after, but you haven't got spasms to undo the work that's been done through surgery. There's a lot of positives. Two people going through the same condition, same treatment. If one's using cannabis, I'd say all the time, 95, all the time, that person will do better. I wish we did have a cure for cancer. It'd be great. In terms of direct in vitro cancer research, there is some good stuff out there from the Spanish. They're doing some really good stuff where they're mixing purified. Again, anyone doing research in a lab with cannabis, it's generally purified cannabinoids, but those purified cannabinoids mixed with chemotherapy drugs are doing a great job. They're showing better results in terms of the chemo drugs are able to attack the mutating and regenerative cells, while the cannabinoids are there protecting the healthy cells, which is great. I think still great. I personally got into cannabis, medical cannabis law reform in 1999 officially, and there was no mention of cannabis curing cancer then, but it was still quite worthy for it to be used. And, even now we've looked at more closely the treatment and pain associated with cannabis, with cancer. And cannabis should be, one of the frontline drugs in terms of that, not a second or third or the illegal option. So, take from that what you will. I suppose ultimately what I really want people to do, if they're serious about using cannabis for medical purposes, is to have a look on the web. Don't believe everything. Try and read really good testimonials of people. And if they do refer to surgery and radiation therapy and chemotherapy, you really can't discount that. I still find it hard to say to someone, don't do chemo, just use cannabis, or don't go through surgery. If you're inoperable, there's a lot of situations like that, and I've had to have a lot of those conversations with people who have got an inoperable prognosis and quite a short time. And look, if they want to use cannabis, which would help their pain, give them a sense of well-being, give them, good sleep with no nightmares, no big concerns about the future, being able to accept what's going on. I think that's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And a lot of those people, they do become the miraculous bounce-back people who do get an extra year, 2 years or 5 years, and it's great. We can, give some credit to cannabis there. But ultimately to rely on it, to think that it's going to do everything that is perceived it can do, I think that's reaching for stuff. But certainly as a first line medicine in treatment for a lot of conditions, cannabis is there, How it works, we still don't know. Just to put that in context as well, we still have pain management research centres in Australia. They still don't know how pain works. We're still working it out. We have pain management clinics all around the country because they still don't know how to manage pain for particular people. So cannabis is showing that it's up there as a therapeutic thing, whether it's, it works on the same pain pathways. We know it helps opioids work better. So cannabis as a medicine, it's going to be very tricky and very difficult for any country and any government to get this up. But there's a fight there and we've got to take it up. It's happening all around the world. Read up more and more on what's going on with cannabis. Cannabis law reforms would be great. We're talking about medical cannabis. I'm also a hemp farmer. Australia, the hemp farming in Australia is stagnated. What's holding it back is hemp seed food. We're the only country in the world not allowed to eat hemp seed food. Every other country can. We've got thriving hemp industries. We're just not allowed to. And it's because of saliva testing. We're the only country in the world using saliva tests. It's only Australian police that are backing these dodgy items. They've been proven to be unreliable. So don't underestimate the holdback there as well. If we're still the only country not allowed to have hemp seed food here because of these saliva tests, it's going to be really hard to for governments to run a credible line that we're going to introduce some kind of meaningful medical cannabis regime still with these saliva tests going on. Saliva tests are great, I suppose, for well, they're not. Drug testing should be a proper thing for testing for impaired driving. Cannabis has such a symbiosis with the body that when humans do use cannabis, it is fat soluble, it's taken in by the body, it's held in there. It's not like other drugs, other hard drugs, synthetics and ice and things like that. And alcohol, which is a poison. Your body's doing all it can to get rid of it. Hard drugs generally, especially ice, goes through the body even quicker than alcohol. You see how you can go from really drunk one night to 12, 18 hours later and you're all fine again. Well, that ice has even moved out quicker. These saliva tests, just to throw another red herring, or not a red herring, another reality check, between sniffer dogs and saliva tests, which unfairly target cannabis and cannabis users, our drug trend users are actually going worse. We are seeing a shift. And so this is another negative consequence of the prohibition of cannabis and the targeting of it and the ease of which it can be caught. And our police can sit around there with really good drug crime statistics when it's just over 1,000 cannabis arrests a week. Anyway, I don't want to bog it down. If there's any questions, I'll let the next speaker come on. Yeah, mate. Yeah.
So the letter you were talking about,
yeah.
For hemp farmers to turn up that government deal, is it going to jeopardise their hemp licence, or is it like a...
Oh, I'm a hemp licensee. I'm going to go there. As a hemp licensee, as a hemp farmer, we're producing vast amounts of cannabinoids. We should be front and centre. But I'm noticing that letter's being broadcast on Facebook and everything, and it's interesting that it's being at some of the nicest hotels in Sydney and the Gold Coast and Brisbane and Tassie. So, there's a lot of money the government's going to be able to save pretty soon that we're spending millions of dollars on medical cannabis. Yeah. No, at least, at the very least, and this is even in the Hemp Party's campaign, we want the government to be using the correct language. We want to hear from our state governments how hard they're pushing the federal health minister and the prime minister. We want to hear from the federal health minister and the prime minister that, yes, we are making representation to the United Nations to get some interim measures up because waiting is too long. We want to hear government acknowledge that there's over 100,000 people in Australia using cannabis every day for medical cannabis, for medical uses, and it's illegal. We want their needs and addresses concerned. I'm very realistic. I've probably given people a more realistic view on what the obstacles are, and I'm not trying to overestimate what we or the Hemp Party can do. But if we can get a change of language and a direction of where the real problems are, and what a possible solution could be in the immediate term through interim measures that can be capped off at 5, 10 or 20 years. I think, I'm just realistic about it. Yeah. And that's just on medical and industrial. Recreational, that's really not happened anywhere in the world. I mean, that's under, Dutch rules. There's some pragmatic stuff that allow the coffee shops to go on. In those US states, Washington and Colorado, citizens-initiated referendums. Australians don't have access to citizens-initiated referendums. We could never get that up, and nor have we got, like in Canada, a Bill of Rights. So what the Hemp Party says on recreational, at the moment it's feeding and it's helping and supplying the medical cannabis users of Australia. If governments want to talk about taxing and regulating it, it's a $5 billion a year industry. It's twice the size of the wine industry in Australia. Cannabis, illegal. It's going great guns. It doesn't need the government's help. But if the government has time to spend on cannabis law reform, we'd prefer that they spent that time addressing medical cannabis and industrial hemp issues. That's how we're looking at it, I hope that answers that question, Any other questions? I'll put Michael back up here. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day in Nimbin and catch us later.